In chapter 2764, the intricate dynamics of familial love, hope, and the generous spirit of Mrs. Lewis are highlighted. Mrs. Lewis, reflecting on her son Duncan's bond with Sony, hoped that he would embrace the role of Sony's stepfather. This idea was spurred by the thought that if he married Liberty, their family would potentially welcome more children in the future, fulfilling Sony's wish for a sibling and ensuring that Duncan had his own biological child. Despite these private aspirations, Mrs. Lewis remained discreet, keeping her thoughts to herself. Serenity, preparing to leave the Lewis residence with Sonia and Titus, was showered with care and concern from Mrs. Lewis. Mrs. Lewis insisted on giving Serenity various nutritional supplements to support her pregnancy, despite Serenity's light-hearted protest about her expanding waistline. She also packed snacks for Sony, demonstrating her affection and desire to support the family's well-being. As part of her hospitality, she gave both children generous red envelopes. While Titus was initially hesitant to accept such a gift, Serenity's encouragement helped him to accept it graciously. Sony, familiar with the Lewis family, was initially reluctant to accept the envelope, feeling it was unnecessary given his frequent visits. However, Mrs. Lewis's insistence, combined with Serenity's subtle approval, led him to accept the gift, avoiding any potential offense to Mrs. Lewis. The chapter portrays Mrs. Lewis's growing affection for Sony. Despite Sony not being her biological grandchild, she cherished him and enjoyed his presence. Sony had become a regular visitor to the Lewis household, often spending time there when Liberty was unavailable. Duncan's frequent care for Sony further strengthened this bond, with Sony often falling asleep at the Lewis home under the gentle care of Mrs. Lewis. As Serenity left with the children, Mrs. Lewis watched them go with a mix of contentment and longing. The departure of Sonia and Titus left a noticeable void, highlighting the quietness of the large Lewis family villa. This silence contrasted sharply with Mrs. Lewis's growing desire for a lively household filled with the energy of children and grandchildren. Her youngest son, Duncan, at 37, was a focal point of her hopes, as she dreamed of a future where the family would be bustling with life. Mrs. Lewis's reflections on her younger days, when she preferred quietness, underscored the changes that come with age. Now, she yearned for the vibrancy of a full house, looking forward to the holidays when her children and grandchildren would gather, temporarily filling the villa with joy and activity. The chapter subtly hints at the loneliness that can accompany aging and the deep seated need for familial connections and the presence of loved ones.